Ethan and Marissa had always believed the woods behind their new house were nothing more than a quiet backdrop, a strip of forest separating them from the rest of town. But on the third night, Ethan woke to the sound of branches breaking in steady, deliberate intervals. When he peered through the window, he saw something tall and crooked standing among the trees, something that tilted its head, as if it already knew his name. The sound came again, faint but deliberate, a slow crack of branches snapping under weight. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing, just an animal wandering too close to the tree line. But the longer I listened, the harder it became to believe that lie. The rhythm of the sound was wrong. It wasn't the careless shuffle of a deer or the frantic rustle of a raccoon. It was steady, almost methodical, like someone pacing the forest floor, counting each step. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it was had no intention of leaving. I pushed myself up and walked toward the window, though every instinct screamed not to. The glass reflected a pale version of my own face, my wide eyes staring back at me. But beyond that was nothing but endless darkness. The trees loomed in a thick wall, their branches twisting together to blot out the moonlight. Still, I thought I saw movement, a darker patch of shadow among shadows, tall and unnaturally still, just waiting. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it didn't disappear. The more I stared, the more certain I became that something stood there, watching. I told myself to close the curtains and go back to bed, but I couldn't. My body refused to listen. I felt glued to the spot, my eyes locked on that shape in the woods. It was like staring into a void that stared back. The air in my room grew colder, heavy, pressing against my skin. Then the sound came again, another deliberate crunch of leaves, closer this time. I stumbled backward, tripping over the corner of my rug, and landed hard on the floor. When I looked up, the shadow seemed closer to the edge of the tree line. I could swear it had moved in the moment I wasn't watching. I scrambled into bed, yanking the covers up to my chin like a child, ashamed of the instinct but unable to fight it. I told myself over and over that I was imagining things, that fear was playing tricks on me. But then, as the night dragged on, the sounds didn't fade. The snapping branches became softer, like weight pressing against the ground but holding back, creeping instead of walking. I strained my ears and I could swear I heard breathing. It wasn't the soft rush of wind through the leaves, it was heavier, slower, stopping when I held my breath, starting again when I exhaled. The clock on my nightstand ticked louder than it ever had, mocking me with every passing second. Minutes felt like hours. I wanted to turn on the lights, but something inside me whispered not to. That light might draw it nearer. So I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, muscles locked, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Every time I blinked, I feared what I'd see when I opened my eyes again. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me under, but even in sleep there was no escape. My dreams were filled with the same shape standing at the tree line, its head tilted slightly as though studying me. No features, no face, just a hollow void cut into the night. I jolted awake with sweat dripping down my back, unsure of how long I'd been out. My room was silent, too silent. I rolled over and glanced at the window again. At first, all I saw was my reflection in the glass, pale and trembling. But then, just beyond the faint glow of the moon, I noticed it. A figure taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its outline jagged and wrong stood just a step closer to my yard than it had before. My blood turned to ice. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of my tired eyes. But when I opened them again, it was still there, still watching. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't going to stop. The morning light did little to ease the tension knotted inside me. I forced myself to believe the terror of last night had been nothing more than exhaustion, my mind turning shadows into monsters. But as soon as I stepped outside, that fragile lie shattered. The grass was damp with dew, but through it ran a line of imprints pressed deep into the soil. They weren't normal footprints. Each one was elongated to narrow at the heel and too wide at the front, with ridges carved into the earth as though claws had dug down. Whatever made them was heavy, heavier than any human, and the impressions led directly from the woods to the edge of my yard. They stopped abruptly, like the thing had been standing there, staring at my house, deciding whether to come closer. I tried to dismiss it as some strange animal track, but the rational explanation wouldn't hold. The prints weren't scattered like an animal searching for food. They were aligned perfectly, one after another, deliberate, like someone walking upright. I felt exposed standing there, as though my backyard had become a stage and I was being watched from behind the curtain of trees. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I backed away toward the door, locking it the moment I stepped inside. The day passed in a haze of nervous energy. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wood, felt amplified. I avoided the windows, afraid of what I might see if I lingered too long. Yet curiosity gnawed at me, whispering that I needed to know more. By afternoon, I found myself drawn back outside, unable to resist following the trail of prints into the woods. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The air grew colder, heavy with a dampness that clung to my skin. The canopy above seemed thicker, blotting out the sunlight until everything looked washed in gray. trees stood scarred with deep gouges, bark shredded as though something enormous had raked across them. Branches were twisted unnaturally, bent at angles too sharp to have happened by storm or wind. My steps crunched over fallen leaves, each sound too loud in the suffocating silence. It felt as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then I found it, a clearing ringed by trees, eerily symmetrical, as if something had carved the space open. The ground was littered with bones. Dozens of them, scattered and broken, gleaming pale against the dark soil. Some looked animal, but others were too large, too human-like to ignore. They weren't cleanly picked apart the way a predator might feed. They were snapped, splintered, crushed under a force strong enough to shatter them like twigs. Dark stains soaked into the dirt, fresh enough that flies still circled lazily above. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat, and I stumbled backward. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but eventually fear propelled me back through the trees, my lungs burning with every hurried breath. By the time I reached the safety of my backyard, the sun had already begun to sink. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding, and pressed my back against it. The thought wouldn't leave me. Those footprints didn't just lead to the clearing. They led back toward my house. Night fell quickly, and with it came the sound again. Not branches this time. Something scraped slowly against the siding of my home, long and deliberate, like nails dragging over wood. The sound moved along the wall, stopping every so often as though to listen. My chest felt tight, and every instinct told me not to move, not to breathe too loudly. I sat in the dark with every light switched on, listening as the scraping circled the house. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out all else. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from every side. I tried to convince myself it had gone, but when I gathered the courage to glance at the nearest window, I saw faint smudges streaked across the glass. They looked like handprints, long, narrow, and pressed from the outside. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat upright in bed, back against the wall, staring at the window as though my gaze alone would keep the thing outside. Every shadow shifted. Every creak of the house made my heart skip. I tried to tell myself it was in my head, that the prints on the glass could have been anything, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something had been there. Something had touched my house, touched the place I thought was safe. By the time the first gray light of dawn slipped into the room, my nerves were frayed raw. I crept from bed, limbs heavy, and checked every lock again, every window latch, every corner. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. The air had a weight to it, a thickness, as if something had lingered and refused to leave. All day I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, scrolled through my phone, paced the rooms until my legs ached, but none of it mattered. I could feel eyes on me even when I was alone. Reflections started to bother me more than they ever had. The black screen of the TV, the glass of a picture frame, even the glossy surface of my coffee table lit all seemed to show movement that wasn't mine. A shift in the corner, a tall shadow sliding out of view just as I looked directly at it. By nightfall, exhaustion pushed me close to collapse. Against my better judgment, I let my eyelids fall. When I woke, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the hallway, feet bare against the cold floorboards. My body trembled as I realized I must have sleepwalked, something I'd never done before in my life. The hallway stretched too long in the dim light, every doorway a mouth yawning open into blackness. At the far end, near the living room, something darker than the shadows leaned against the wall. My breath caught. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head bent at an angle that looked painful, watching me without moving. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and the hallway was empty again. My chest heaved, sweat slicking my skin. I stumbled back into my room, shut the door, and pressed my body against it, as if that thin piece of wood could keep me safe. My hands shook too violently to hold my phone. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't explain this without sounding insane. Worse, I wasn't sure help would even matter. When I finally dared to check my room again, something new waited for me. On the carpet, just a step from my bed, were muddy prints, long, narrow, with ridges where claws should have been. They started at the door, right where I stood now, and ended at my mattress. My knees nearly buckled, and I clutched the nightstand to keep myself upright. I didn't move those prints, and I didn't hear anyone come in. I spent the rest of the night curled on the floor, too afraid to climb back into bed. My eyes burned, wide open, refusing to let me drift. Time stretched and twisted until I wasn't sure if hours or minutes had passed. The silence grew so thick it was almost deafening. Then came the smell. At first faint, then overwhelming, metallic, sharp, like rusted iron. It filled the room, coated my tongue, sank into my skin. I gagged but couldn't escape it. It was as if the air itself had turned rotten. And beneath that stench, I could feel it. A presence close enough to touch, breathing just beyond sight. I held still, every muscle locked. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would give me away. The feeling didn't fade. It pressed closer, filling every corner of the room, wrapping around me like invisible hands. When the first rays of morning crept through the curtains, the presence slipped away as if it had never been there. But when I finally stood, weak and shaking, I saw the sheets on my bed crumpled down on one side. The pillow was still damp, as though something heavy had been lying there beside me, breathing into the dark. I stopped leaving the house after that night. The world beyond my door no longer felt safe, but neither did the walls I had built around myself. Every room felt tainted, as if something unseen had seeped into the very foundation, waiting for me no matter where I turned. Time lost its meaning. The days blurred together into a cycle of hunger I ignored, exhaustion I couldn't give into, and silence that pressed down like a weight. My phone rang a few times, but I never answered. I couldn't bring myself to pretend everything was normal. How could I, when I felt its presence breathing down my neck even in broad daylight? I covered the mirrors first. The reflections were the worst. Every time I caught a glimpse of myself, there was something else, something behind me. It wasn't always clear, but the suggestion was enough: tall and crooked, edges too sharp to belong to a human body. Sometimes its head tilted as if studying me, as though curious about how long I could hold out. No matter how fast I turned, there was never anything there. Covering the glass didn't make it disappear, but at least it gave me one less way to see it. The nights were the hardest. My ears strained for any sound, my eyes burned from refusing to shut, and every creak of the floorboards above made my chest tighten. I started to imagine it crawling inside the walls, slithering through the beams, waiting for the right moment to push its way out. I moved from room to room, never staying in one place too long, as if motion alone could keep it from finding me. But no matter where I hid, the smell always came back. That metallic temps of blood and rust, thick enough to sting my throat, filling every corner. It was like the house itself had begun to rot. One night, I woke to find the window in my room wide open. I never touched it. Cold air rushed in, whipping the curtains like frantic hands. On the floor beneath it lay something I didn't recognize at first: a strip of fabric, torn and soaked with something black and sticky. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was skin, thin and leathery, curling at the edges like it had been shed. I crouched down to touch it, but before my fingers met the surface, I felt warmth against my neck. Not the cold air from the window, but a hot breath, slow and steady. Every hair on my body stood up. I turned my head inch by inch, every second stretching into eternity. But there was nothing behind me, only the empty room, the swaying curtains, the stench of metal thick enough to choke on. When I looked back at the bed, the pillow was pressed inward, the fabric dipped as though someone invisible still lay there. My chest seized, and I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. The bulb shattered, and for a brief moment, the room plunged into darkness. I swear I saw it then, crouched in the corner, limbs bent too far, its body folded like an insect. When the hall light flickered in from the open door, it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the open window until morning bled across the horizon. I told myself I'd close it when the sun was high, when I had proof the world outside still existed. But even then I couldn't. I was too afraid that the moment I touched the frame, something would grab my wrist from the other side. The next evening I heard the scratching again. Not outside this time, but from inside the ceiling above my bed. The slow drag of claws against wood, carving into the beams, patient and deliberate. Dust rained down in tiny clouds as the sound shifted across the ceiling, following me as I moved through the room. I pressed my palms over my ears until they ached, but nothing could block it out. When it finally stopped, I thought the silence might break me. I forced myself to look up, against every instinct screaming at me not to. And there they were, long, deep claw marks etched into the plaster directly above my bed, fresh and jagged, dripping with something black. I couldn't tell if it was sap from the beams or blood. All I knew was that it was new, and it was waiting. Days have folded into one long, thin strip of fear. I stopped measuring time by clocks. I measure it by the sounds and the small changes that tell me the thing is learning me. It no longer scratches at the siding or prowls the yard. It waits in places I used to trust. The hollow under the stairs, the space behind the dryer, the seam between floorboards where dust collects. The house breathes differently now, like a living thing that has swallowed a secret. I move through it like a trespasser in my own life, careful, slow, so as not to announce my presence and give it reason to test me. But testing is exactly what it does. Every night I wake to something new. A smear on the wallpaper. A hairline crack that wasn't there before. A faint smear of dark on cabinet hinges. Small marks, like signatures, left by something that knows how to be patient. I tried to record it once, desperate for proof. I set up my phone with the camera facing the bedroom and let it record while I sat in the living room holding my breath. The footage that saved to the cloud was not what I expected. For hours the image was static. The little red dot of recording my only companion. Then, near dawn, coiled shadows moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate, as if the roof itself was breathing. The thing stepped into the frame with a silence that made my limbs feel hollow. It did not look like the shadow I had seen at the tree line. It mimicked me. It leaned over my bed and placed something on the pillow. The camera caught the shape from an angle that made it impossible to see details, only limbs and a broad, empty headbutt beneath its hand. The pillow shifted as if something heavy had been there. Then the impossible happened. The footage showed me sitting up in bed. I watched myself move the same way I remembered, the same small pause, the same hollowed look, but my mouth stayed closed. My hands were not mine. They were too long, and the fingers appeared darker at the tips, as if stained. I watched myself place a hand against my own face and then press, fingers splaying like roots. The image blurred, as though the camera couldn't decide if it wanted to keep recording. I deleted the video and told myself that deleting it would erase the memory. It did not. Instead, that night I woke with my cheeks wet and the sour taste of iron in my mouth. I felt the faintest prickle behind my eyes, like the sleep had not ended so much as been pushed aside to make room for something else. I checked my hands in the mirror and found tiny crescent marks along my palms, pale scars that had not been there before. They were not cuts from a fall or a scrape from working outside. They were precise, curved like old bite marks. There were other signs. My reflection in the darkened television looked wrong. For a moment when I walked past, the glass held a stranger who mirrored my movements a fraction of a beat slower. It took me days to admit what my gut and the evidence were saying. Whatever had been at the tree line had spent months learning to be me. It had not just watched, it had practiced. It had tried on my life like clothes to see how they fit. I began to catalog things. Small objects moved places. A spoon placed in the drawer would be on the counter in the morning. Books shifted on the shelf by a gap's width. Plants were knocked over but not chewed. The predator did not need to eat my things or make noise. It preferred the slow terror of rearrangement, the quiet assertion that it could be anywhere I relied on. The worst discovery was a stack of photographs I had hidden in a shoebox under my bed. They were not mine. Faces stared up at me in those pictures, people I had never met taken in dim rooms with a steady voyeur's angle. Each face had the same raw, unfocused look as my own in the captured footage. Eyes wide, mouth closed, skin paled by something that had been close. I lined the photos on my floor like evidence and watched my skin crawl. In the corner of one photo, the edge of a dark shape curled into the frame, the same crooked outline I had seen in my hallway. And then I found the journal. It was tattered and tucked beneath the loose floorboard in the closet where I kept winter blankets. I had never written in it. The pages were filled with someone else's handwritings, more neat, patient lines that read like practice attempts at me. The entries described nights, times, behaviors, the exact rhythm of my breathing. It catalogued my favorite chair, where I kept coffee mugs, how long it took me to lock the back door. At the very end, the handwriting stopped and a long, blunt line of ink ran down the paper as if the pen had been forced into the page. Underneath, scrawled almost slangily, was a single sentence that I read over and over until the ink blurred. I learned her well. There is no separating it now. If I sleep, I wake with new marks, like the thing used me to learn how to feel my own skin. If I hide, I find small trophies left in places I cannot reach. Shreds of clothing pressed under my pillow, a clump of hair tucked behind a light switch. Once, I woke to find the bathtub full, water dark and smelling of metal. My hands were under the water, though I remembered falling asleep at the sink. The house has stopped being a shelter and started being a classroom for whatever is inside me. Tonight, the air is quiet in a way I can't stand. I can feel movement beneath my ribs, a slow, searching pressure that slides like a tongue. I press my palm to my chest and my fingers press into something warm that pushes back. It is not a heartbeat, I know. It is older and patient and practiced. The light from my phone casts a pale circle against the ceiling, and in that small, bright place, I see my reflection in the dark glass, the same slow mirroring, the same hollowed face, and for the first time I notice the pupils. They are not quite right. They are a fraction too black, too deep, and they do not blink when I blink. I hold my breath, and when I breathe out, something in the dark laughs without a sound, as a mouth might if it had words but no voice. My hand slips from my chest as if the thing beneath it has let go. The relief is brief. I am not alone in my skin. I can feel it learning to breathe with me, practicing the rhythm as if it will soon be the only one left who remembers how.